around any shared meal? Is there some good news in our shared table fellowship for the world today that could be a good news of healing, of welcome, of hospitality, of inclusion? So let me pause there and see if any of this is making sense. Does that sort of story of the origins of Eucharist shed some light on it a little bit? I can't remember what I have for this. Oh, yeah. This is a quote by Scott. What is his last name? I've got it on the next slide. There it is, Scott Barchi, who's a New Testament scholar. One distinctive feature of Jesus' ministry was his practice of a radically inclusive and non-hierarchical table fellowship as a central strategy in his announcement and redefinition of the inbreaking rule of God. One of the things, and I think this gets missed a lot, again, in modern Western society, in our fast food culture, where we don't pay as much attention to who belongs around tables. We don't even have shared, lots of families today don't even share meals. So the significance of table fellowship in those gospel accounts gets lost. By the way, if you know the author Michael Pollan, who's written a lot on food and food production and food sharing and so on in years, I gasped out loud. I forget in which one of his books this appeared. But he said, basically now in contemporary American culture, 1 in every 5 meals, so isn't that 20%, I think? 1 in every 5 meals in this country is eaten in front of a dashboard in your car. So it's not even with other people or TV at home. So that makes it difficult for us to appreciate this quote. Especially, this is what caught my attention too. Central strategy. The way Jesus shared meals was a central strategy for his announcement of the kingdom of God. And what this also reminds me then is connect, many of us, myself included, think of this table up here, this altar, as being rooted in the Last Supper. Of course it is, right? Yes, of course. And make sure to connect the so-called Last Supper with all the suppers that came before. Because there's throughout the gospel accounts, there are all these stories of Jesus sharing food and meals leading up to that moment when he shares a final meal with his closest friends.
Try to say this without getting myself in trouble.
Good luck, Don.
Good luck. Isn't there a difference between taking the Eucharist and your belief in, whether it be the whole deal, the blood and flesh of Christ, or whether it's symbolic in your mind, and the sitting down with a group of folks and sharing a meal without that theological overlay?
It's a really great question, and it's not, and it's actually running. It's running in my head too. This is a preview of one of a couple of the things that I want to sort of review next week for the third part of this series. But here's a little preview of it. So Don, to rephrase your question is, isn't there a difference and I'm putting words a little bit in your mouth, but this is where it comes down. This is often where churches, clergy, and others struggle. Isn't there a legitimate and important difference to be made between what happens at the Last Supper, when Jesus says some very distinctive things about what's going on there, and all the other meals that he had with others in the course of those gospel accounts? Isn't there a difference to be made that we should pay attention to? And some go further, and this is an argument that I've had actually with a theologian colleague of mine about how the Eucharist is not only a memorial meal, it's else as well. So it's not just when we're at that table, we're not only remembering all the many different kinds of meals that Jesus shared. We're remembering something very distinctive that happened at the last one. And I'm very sympathetic to that important difference. My ongoing question is, what kind of difference does that difference make in how we practice table fellowship together? And I'll just, again, as a little preview to this, what some people would say is, the difference it makes is that we do have some preconditions and requirements to come to Eucharist in a way that Jesus would not have done with those other meals. And so that creates a certain sense of religious order to our lives. So we need to have certain pre-qualifications in place before you come to the table, and so on and so forth. I understand that, and one of the things that I keep urging all of us here at All Saints to think about is how we present ourselves to the wider world. Is this a place where there are lots of barriers to access? Or is this a place where we say, God is coming to us fully with arms open wide? And that's what this table means. Full embrace. Grace as no requirements. And I think that's often hard for us. Good morning, Carol. Hi. For all sorts of reasons. But again, that's something that I'm hoping that we can have some further conversation about next week. Anything else before? Oh my gosh, okay, let me do this quickly. I was looking at the time, heavens. So I want to just give us a very quick sense of when I say Jesus was ignoring the rules about table fellowship, it's sometimes hard for us to imagine, well, what rules? What was really going on in that first century context? Here's a very brief sort of overview of that. There were very, very specific rules of engagement, if you will, for sharing meals, boundaries for table fellowship. Here's one way to organize all of the rules. One was extended family. So we're very familiar with this too. The most common context for a shared meal was the biological family, but in the first century Mediterranean world, that would have been an extended family. Aunts, uncles, nephews, nieces, cousins, grandparents, grandchildren, everybody. So as long as you're part of that extended network, you belong around the table together, right? Social class was another category to pay attention to, with whom it was acceptable to share a meal. Social classes were very, very well defined in the first century Mediterranean world. By the way, they're pretty well defined in modern American society too. We just don't talk about it as much. It was talked about a lot in first century Mediterranean cultures. People invited their social, religious, and economic equals to share food. One of the reasons why you would invite your economic equals to share food with you is because they can return the favor. Think about some of the parables that Jesus tells about overturning that sense of reciprocity. Invite people who can't pay you back, he says. And one of the reasons for that is precisely because the practice was you invite people to your table who can pay you back. So that's one of the rules that he broke. Hierarchical strata. Good morning, David. Within a meal setting, there were also, it's not just either you're invited or you're not. Once you're invited to the meal in the first century Mediterranean world, you also had certain places you were supposed to sit to indicate your relative value compared to the others around the table. So there are all sorts of parables, again, that Jesus tells about this and different things that Jesus does in his own meal sharing that challenges that sense of hierarchical strata. Jesus challenged this norm. Maybe the most important way that he did this was by washing his own disciples' feet. That was extremely unheard of. He was the teacher. They were supposed to wash his feet. That's one example of the hierarchy of value that happens around the table. And of course, religious practice, religious affiliation matter at the table. If you are ritually unclean in that first century context, you should not eat with those who are ritually clean. There are certain steps you have to take to make yourself ready to participate in the meal. This is where he gets into most of his trouble. He eats with tax collectors and sinners. That's the phrase that comes up all the time, right? Tax collectors and sinners are ritually unclean, according to certain of the religious rules of the day. He also got in trouble because he didn't ceremonially wash his hands, nor did his disciples before a meal. That was to indicate, it's not, there was no germ theory in the first century, right? So it wasn't about making sure you didn't have germs. That showed that you made sure that you're ritually clean. When you wash your hands, that was demonstrating to everybody around there that, yep, I'm good. And he was like, nope, doesn't matter. And of course, in the Acts of the Apostles, Peter, we're running out of time, aren't we? Yep. Peter gets into trouble for eating with Gentiles. There's this huge thing that happens almost in the middle of the Acts of the Apostles where he has this vision, right, about what food is clean and unclean. That's a metaphor for people who are clean and unclean. And that's the big shift that happens in Acts of the Apostles, that Christianity is not just a sect within Judaism, it's for Gentiles too. And everybody's welcome to the table. So I'll just end with that to suggest that now, some 2,000 years later, I think this still matters, this kind of radical social practice of hospitality and welcome in a world that is deeply, deeply fragmented, fractured, divided, and violent. There might be a way to invite people into thinking differently about community, about healing, and about the bonds that can bring us together. Does that make some sense anyway? Any final comments, thoughts, questions, anything from people who might be watching us online? Y'all have been very attentive, and I thank you for that. And then we'll talk a little bit next week about the significance. I'll invite us to read and make sure that it's available, little excerpts from John Koenig's book called Soul Banquets, in which he really argues that meal sharing and Eucharist is at the heart of Christian mission today for a world in need of healing. So I'll invite us to think about that and think about how we do Eucharist here at All Saints as part of that. Yeah? Thank you.